Chautauquas, and perhaps one of these days all of Ruston will celebrate with us. I'm going to read a quote that I love to read. Chautauqua is an idea, embracing the all things of life, art, science, society, religion, patriotism, education, whatsoever tends to enlarge, refine, and ennoble the individual. It is the aim to take people on all sides of their natures and make them new, more intelligent, and thoughtful in a world of ideas. And this is John Vinson, who was one of the co-founders of the original Chautauqua. I just get more and more excited every year we do it, and I'm just so proud that we have an audience tonight to listen to Alan. Alan Tewton is an old friend, a high school friend, and a person that has been interested in the museum since our 50th anniversary of our high school reunion. He came in and just fell in love with our Native American exhibit and brought things for us to share. I put some out on the table in the back that you can go and look at. I have to tell you that he and Mary Bell are very special, and I'm just so proud that he was interested in this topic. This is a topic that many of our families from this area were into, including my grandfather. So I'm going to turn the program over to Alan and let him take over. If you can't hear, if you'll just let him know.
Have you ever thrown out an idea that maybe a committee would take on? Well, that's kind of how I got started here. Margaret Ann or someone sent out a request for ideas for the fall Chautauqua, and I suggested something about the early timber industry in North Louisiana, Lincoln Parish. And somehow it kind of evolved that I'm going to do it. But so that's one of those dangers when you speak up. I also like audience participation. So I'm going to begin by asking a question. And this may be a bit of history for some of you, at least going back, I know, into the 1960s or 1970s, when you used to get bills in the mail before there was PayPal and all of the computer payments. But when you sometimes would get a bill in the mail, along with that bill was there a little flower or something in there, or a little circle that you scratched and you get a little odor there. Do you remember those? I know Lewis and Company used to do it. Some of you remember that. Well, this is the way I'm going to approach this presentation tonight. I'm going to scratch that circle, and maybe there will be a little bit of a fragrance there that will spur your interest in learning a little bit more about the timber industry and other areas of Lincoln Parish. I had a personal interest, and that was where I first started scratching. But the more I scratched, the more fragrant this became. So I did some research. Typically, in today, I started Googling sites and finding all sorts of things. I was allowed to use a couple of books from local families, and I'll mention those a little bit more in a minute. But I'm first going to begin with a broader scope of the timber industry in Louisiana, or more from the central part to the north. There are several local lumber operators in Lincoln Parish during the time period of 1880 to 1930, and that's where I'm going to concentrate my presentation tonight. Surely the timber industry has been a big part of Lincoln Parish for many, many years since 1930. But any one of these sawmill families that I will be mentioning would make for an interesting standalone presentation. Remember tonight, though, I'm only going to scratch the surface in hopes you like the smell and want to come back for more. Prior to 1880, timber production in Louisiana was fairly small, meeting local needs and confined largely to areas along the waterways. In 1880, Louisiana ranked 13th in the United States for dollar value of timber. By 1920, only 40 years later, we had moved to number 2 in the nation. After the Civil War, there was a construction boom, and vast forests of the East and Midwest had already been largely depleted. Also, in 1866, Congress reported over 6 million acres of unsold federal land in Louisiana. Funds were needed to relieve the war debt, and demand for lumber focused out-of-state capital to invest in large tracts of government land. The new lumber industry changed the look of our state. Large sections of the state in a short period of time were sold and became, and this is a word probably not in Webster's dictionary, but in one of the books that I had, became stumpscapes of barren, cut-over land. Especially hard hit was the west central part of the state. In only 20 years, 70% of Vermilion Parish had been clear-cut. Large tracts of land could be bought for less than $1 an acre. Can you believe? There was some recorded at 45 and 50 cents an acre. The problem with timber harvesting was the removal of the tree once cut. You could buy all this property and own all of this land, but then what were you going to do with it? The solution was the marriage of the timber industry with that of railroad construction. In 1880, there were 652 miles of track in all of Louisiana. By 1910, only 30 years later, that 652 miles had grown to 5,554 miles. Some track lines were investor-owned, and many of the larger sawmill operators laid their own track from woods to the mill or from the mill to the trunk line. In 1912, the American Lumberman Equipment Register listed 275 sawmills in Louisiana. This was only the ones registered with Louisiana Lumberman. I would dare say from other stories I've read, there were many more backyard sawmills and others in existence. One of the large early pioneers was a company formed by Robert Long and Victor Bell of Kansas City in 1887. At one time, Long Bell Lumber Company owned 150,000 acres in the central part of the state, cutting mostly longleaf and shortleaf pine. They also cut hardwood for flooring and started a creosoting plant in Shreveport. By 1920, they began to look to the western states for a timber source due to the depletion of the Louisiana forest. Remember, they were probably very heavy in Vernon Parish, where 70% of the entire parish had been cut. Although still operating as a company, like many other companies, they did face bankruptcy in 1931 and reorganized. Trees were cut by hand and hauled to the mill by mule teams, or in some cases by a steam-powered winch. The mills used steam-powered engines using cut-offs from lumber to fuel the furnace to cut the trees into lumber. Because of this, fire was always a threat and claimed many mills. Most of the mills used large circular saws to cut and trim trees into lumber. I brought a circular saw blade. This one is from a Willamette mill dating back to 1980s, early 1990s. And they were cutting much smaller trees. These were virgin pine trees that these early lumbermen were cutting. the blades that they were using on these steam-powered engines, I don't have one, but you may have seen maybe in front of an antique shop or something, somewhere driving down the road. This blade, instead of being 2 feet across, they were 5 and 6 feet tall because the trees themselves were 3.5 feet in diameter. Whole new towns were built by the lumber companies to accommodate the mill workers. This has been a real interesting concept to learn more about the mill towns. A spur line or a few miles of track would be laid into the tract of land being harvested. Here, a mill would be set up and a town built around it. Company towns existed for the sole purpose of producing lumber. Generally, everything was built and owned by the company. Housing, churches, schools, hospital, commissary. The commissaries were also the social centers for these isolated communities. Because of transportation limitations, it was easier to dismantle and move the sawmill to a new location and establish a new town. Many such towns became ghost towns from this practice, and I'll mention one or two of these later. By contrast, today, we see log trucks traveling some distance from the cut site to the mill. It just wouldn't work that way for a team of mules to haul a few logs 30 or 40 miles. Usually it was less than a mile that these mules would haul, maybe to a wagon or to a flat car on the train track. The clear cut and move practice began to present problems with what to do with the cut over land. The taxes on the unproductive land became a burden for many of the lumber companies. The previously mentioned Long Bell Lumber Company established 3 possible solutions. First, that land capable of growing and producing was to be sold for farming purposes. Second, that land best suited for growing timber was to be subject to reforestation. Third, that part of the land which was not suitable for either of the above was reverted to the state or in default of taxes. So serious was the problem, the state legislature passed an act in 1910 that any landowner could contract with the state to plant trees on land and care for them for at least 30 years and have a tax assessment set at $1 per acre for the entire time of the contract. In 1914, lumberman Henry Hardner was thinking of future forest when he signed the state's first reforestation contract for thousands of acres of Urania Lumber Company. He had lobbied the legislature for 10 years to get such a bill passed, and many consider him the father of forestry or of reforestation in the South. Now for some of the local lumbermen. You may recognize some of the names because of their leadership and business acumen stretched from these early years several generations into the present day. A few made great impacts on our parish in fields other than forestry, but I will limit my comments to the lumber industry. Benjamin James was a Welsh immigrant with a young family, was working in the coal fields of Ohio in 1875. Ben decided to move his family to California, and with a covered wagon loaded, he changed his mind. Anyone know why he changed his mind? News of General Custer's defeat in South Dakota came in, and that was part of the trail that he was going to embark on. So instead of going to California, the James family headed south. They came to Arkansas. In Arkansas, Ben purchased 80 acres of land, began harvesting and selling timber. Ben then began contracting with sawmills to haul their lumber to a nearby railroad junction. Ben had some mules, wagon, and would bring the logs to the mill and had that contract going. As the mills moved, so did the James family. The girls, and at least the youngest son, Tom, went to school a few months out of the year as the family moved about. In 1894, the family arrived in Junction City, and according to Floyd James, written in a memoir, on the Louisiana side of Junction City. When barely voting age, Tom became manager of a sawmill, and 2 years later, in 1901, he and his brother George purchased their own mill. Tom married Maggie Lewis, and their first child, Thomas L., was born. Tom moved his portable sawmill around several places before almost facing financial ruin in 1907 recession. This also affected some other mills that I will mention. It was this recession that claimed the Dubach Lumber Company. Tom's brother had been operating a sawmill in Bernice and helped Tom purchase the Dubach Lumber Company. Fred B. Dubach, and I'll mention that in a few minutes. Tom was a good manager and mastered every phase of lumber operation and did not shy away from any dirty job that needed to be done. And this is, I was mentioning to Marvin a little while ago, aside from the numbers and the facts, some of these family stories to me are the real treasures of our history. And in this book, and this one Tommy Folk shared with me, if you have an opportunity to read it, I would highly recommend it. But Tom, while he was owner of the mill, he did not shy away from hard work. There are stories about him seeing someone struggling to get a cross tie up to help lay a portion of spur track. Tom jumps out of the car and helps him with the cross tie. In another example, someone was hurt and needed to be taken into the mill town. Tom loads him into the locomotive and drives the locomotive himself into town. But some of these, I think, are really fascinating stories about the history of some of these people. In 1921, Tom moved the family to Ruston. One of the primary reasons for this decision was Tom's realization that the sawmill business was playing out and for better educational opportunities for their children. He began investing in oil and gas interest and later in road construction. And I will end here, since I am limiting my comments to the lumber industry, but there is so much more to explore about that family. Fred B. Dubach. Although there were settlers in Dubach area as early as the late 1840s, and Gene, who might that have been?
The Autries, but actually the Colvins were there before the Autries.
Okay. The town's, although the town's origin date to the arrival of the Arkansas Southern Railway in 1898. With the coming of the railroad, this opened for development the lumber industry. In 1899, Fred B. Dubach, a lumberman from St. Louis, Missouri, arrived in the area and started the Dubach Lumber Company, which soon became the second largest in the South. While there was already a little settlement there, Fred did erect the typical mill town with the commissary, the schools, the church, and everything was all right around his house. That house, by the way, still stands, and you might want to drive by that sometime and note that it dates back to about 1901. His lumber mill was located right across the road from his house. The lumber company was a major factor in the growth and development of what in 1901 was chartered as the town of Dubach. However, they only lived in the home for a short while because in 1906, Dubach sold his mill and the family returned to St. Louis. The home was a grand structure and became part of the sale of Dubach Lumber Company to Tom and George James. Tom and his family lived in the home until their move to Ruston in 1921. Between 1921 and 1929, the Dubach home was rented to another lumberman. Where's Margaret Ann?
Here I am.
Who was that rented to?
B.H., Mr. Rain.
To B.H. Rainwater.
B.H. was born in that house.
Oh,
But
okay.
there's a picture right behind you. You want me to get it?
Now, I invite to maybe look at all of the
I'll
things
bring
there
it
in a
out.
minute. Okay, I'm going to move on to another family, but start listening to these names because they're still names that we know here in Ruston for many generations. The Davis brothers. Like many of the lumbermen who developed North Louisiana's timber resources, the Davis brothers trained in South Arkansas before opening their mill in Ansley, Louisiana. Do you know where Ansley is? Just not too far south of here. In 1873, John Davis' oldest three sons, ranging in age from 21 to 14, were working full-time in the Arkansas mill, and the younger brother, Robert, age 8, worked part-time. Their father died of a stroke in 1891, and the four brothers began their own lumber operation in South Arkansas. By the late 1890s, most of the virgin timber in South Arkansas had been cut, and the four brothers looked to the south. In 1899, the Davis brothers traveled to Ruston by train and set off on horseback to survey timberlands in Lincoln, Jackson, and Bienville parishes. In 1900, they established a mill town a few miles south of Ruston and named it Ansley after Virgil Davis's wife. In 1902, James, Virgil, John, and Robert Davis incorporated the Davis Brothers Lumber Company. Employee housing owned by the company was rented for $3 a month. Robert and Virgil were the most publicly visible of the four Davis brothers, often hosting social events. In 1908, Robert married Charlotte Long, and they had two daughters. Virgil and his wife had four daughters, and I hate to start naming names because some might get left out, but Mary Olive, Charlotte, Margaret, Virginia, Alvern, Helen, Dorothy, I think were Davis' daughters, and many of you will know them perhaps by their married names, and I'll touch a little bit more on that toward the end here. In cooperation, between 1906 and 1915, the family business expanded rapidly in timber holdings, sales offices, private logging, railroads, and two additional mills in Ansley. The town's population grew from 25 to a high of 1,000 in 1930. In cooperation with Davis Brothers, George and T.L. James operated the Louisiana Lumber Company with a sales office in St. Louis, selling lumber from the three mills in Bernice, Dubach, and Ansley. The families just keep meshing together as they move forward. Even greater growth was experienced between 1916 and 1929. Sales increased nearly 600% over the previous 10-year period. Robert and Virgil used their profits to invest in other areas of the business community. This growth came to an abrupt halt in the early 1930s. The death of the last three Davis brothers forced the leadership to restructure, while the Great Depression forced the company to curtail production. The Ansley Mill shut down in 1957, although the company continued operation until 1972, when holdings were sold to Willamette Industries. I know there are at least two or three of you in here who remember that Ansley Mill. I was talking to Marvin, and I'm sure James probably visited that mill when it was still in operation. Jim Moore's dad was selling mill equipment, and he remembers going with his dad on a sales trip as a youngster to the mill down there. So that mill, while it curtailed operations way back from the 1920s, was still in existence that many of you perhaps remember. Next, I'm going to the Hodge Hunt years. In 1889, Huey Hodge Cohort, that cohort is a conglomerate of investors, constructed and operated a temporary mill in Macedonia. Anyone know where Macedonia is? They now call it Jonesboro. Yeah. And 2 years later, moved the mill to Hodge. Hodge and John Hunt also joined together in a mill operation in Macedonia. In 1903, O.E. Hodge and John Hunt sold their interest in the Huey Hodge conglomerate and started a series of temporary mills in the surrounding areas, mostly in Jackson and Bienville Parish, and even into Oklahoma. By 1905, they were ready to return to north central Louisiana, and the towns of Ruston and Winfield engaged in a spirited incentive competition to bring the mill to their town. Winfield was the winner, and the mill was constructed under the name of Sulphur Timber and Lumber Company. I'm going to divest here just a little bit. I mentioned earlier that each mill town had a commissary or general store. It was a common practice to regularly pay mill workers in commissary coupons, a practice that certainly benefited the mill owners as well. This became a problem, though, when there was a general store competing in town, since the coupons could only be used at the mill store. Huey Hodge even instituted a policy that any employee caught purchasing from a competing store would be fired. A competing merchant in Hodge, J.J. Lewis, filed a suit for these, and these were the name of the suit, or the terms: malicious acts illegally interfered with his business. The case eventually went to the Louisiana Supreme Court, and in 1908, the court upheld Huey Hodge's right to protect its business interest by breaking up a competing business within a company town. That, I guess, shows you the power and influence that the company towns had, even on the Supreme Court. These are the stories that I like to pass along. 2 years after building the sulfur lumber mill in Winfield, they sold their timber industry to Grant Timber Company and tore down the sawmill to move again. They returned to the Huey Hodge mill in Hodge, and with other investors bought out the Hueys and other partners. Just 6 months after the purchase, a national financial crisis resulted in a collapse of the lumber market. This was, again, that 1906-1907 recession. I guess I had not heard too much about that recession until reading this, but apparently it was quite severe, certainly to the timber industry. They managed to survive the financial crisis. After 1907, the mill proved very profitable, and they were able to consolidate ownership. They achieved success by diverting into more profitable manufacture of veneers and oak flooring and a planing mill. In the New England states, the demand for these higher-end veneers and oak floors was a major marketing process, and their mills did have connecting lines that could ship the lumber into the New England states. The company retained the name Huey Hodge until 1921, when it was changed to the Hodge Hunt Lumber Company. Competition was fierce among the various mills to get the best rail rates. Mills that had short lines of their own could use them exclusively, charge higher rates to other users, and be in a better position to negotiate rail rates with the trunk lines. The lumber industry was tightly intertwined with the rail industry. Remember that the growth from number 13 to number 2, remember the growth from 600 miles of track to almost 6,000 miles of track. I mean, they go, and the comment I made here was growth of each was as parallel as the tracks laid. Huey Hodge practiced an early form of reforestation known as selective cutting on some of its land about the same time as Hardner, but was much less publicized. The Hodge Hunt leadership also recognized the need for selective cutting to reforest areas harvested. Instead of completely clear cutting, every so often they would leave a good seed tree that would naturally reforest the area. The Hodge Hunt Lumber Company prospered for 25 years under their leadership, and the men invested into other interests in North Louisiana. In later years, their sons, Edwin Hodge and Alex T. Hunt Sr., took over controlling interest of their holdings. Those are names certainly that many of you would recognize. These successful lumbermen were visionary and astute business leaders in other areas of the community. Listen to the names of men who founded the Citizens Bank and Trust in Ruston in 1922. R.W. Davis, T.L. James, O.E. Hodge, J.S. Hunt. Now, I'm not sure what happened to that bank in the 1930s, but it was this conglomerate or this grouping of timber men who formed the Citizens Bank and Trust in Ruston. There is so much more to tell about these lumber industry giants that a single program dedicated to each one would be more appropriate. Another book that I got a lot of information from, and thanks to James for passing this along, and Elizabeth, that Pioneers of the Piney Woods is about the Hunt Davis family, and it goes into much more detail and extends well beyond 1930. Very fascinating, and would encourage you, if you're interested more in a little bit of history, to get access to a copy of this book. And thanks to Trot, who some years ago had the foresight to have someone write and interview some of the people who were still alive that could pass along some of the stories in this book, and a couple of which that I have mentioned here. I would like to close by telling you about a lesser-known lumber company based in Ruston during this era. Because of a personal interest, this is where my research started on the topic. Have any of you ever heard of the Wyatt Lumber Company? W-Y-A-T-T. Okay. I grew up knowing the name, but never knew much about it. And actually, I still don't. I was talking to Marvin a few minutes ago that, dang, I wish when I was a 14-year-old, I had sat down with my granddad and asked him a lot of questions about that. And, Dad, tell me about these stories in 1900. But alas, as a 14-year-old, I passed that opportunity, and it's gone. The stories they could tell are the real treasures of our history and culture. However, in the early 1900s, Abraham H. Henderson operated a sawmill in Gandy, Louisiana. It was a typical mill town of its time, but now all that's left of this once thriving town is a sign on an isolated stretch of railroad track that says Gandy. My dad was born in Gandy in 1917, and Mr. Henderson's later-to-be son-in-law, Frederick Richardson, was also born there. I think my grandfather, E.L. Tewton, Edgar Lacey, may have been manager of the mill at the time for Mr. Henderson. The mill was moved to Wyatt, and that's where the name comes from, Louisiana, a still existing community just south of Jonesboro. The White Lumber Company was formed with its office located in Ruston. In 1919, a lease agreement shows White Lumber listed 4 rooms in the Harris Hotel at the rate of $4 per room per month. And much of this information that I'm gathering about White, fortunately, I went to the courthouse and looked up records, and I didn't know if I would find anything at all, but when I looked up White Lumber Company, I found about 20 pages of deeds, land purchases, leases, and other company documents. So that was fascinating. Unfortunately, the courthouse in Jonesboro, which was be the county, the parish seat for White, burned sometime, historians made in the 20s maybe, early 30s, and all of their records were destroyed. So search there would be fruitful. Business for the White Lumber Company grew as more land was acquired, and the office moved in 1922 to the top floor of a new building owned by Judge J.B. Halstead. And when I start thinking about family connections, again, kind of a personal thing, my mother-in-law's second husband was J.B. Halstead, the son of Judge Halstead, where my grandfather had his office. So, grandson. Okay. Abraham H. Henderson was born in 1873 in Spearsville, Louisiana. He and his wife, Eva, had a daughter, Virginia, born in Wyatt in 1905. Virginia married Legs Richardson, and I've heard that name from my dad years ago. Pardon?
He was a mayor.
Mayor, yeah, okay. Married Legs Richardson, and some of the personal information I have came from their son, Frederick, and his wife, Marcia. And some of that, the Henderson house, look at just a block over here, it's the house that Steve Hearn now lives in, the big house on the corner, and that was the house that Mr. Henderson built and owned. And when they moved out, Marcia and Frederick donated a china cabinet to the museum here. And the other day, Margaret Ann said, I think I saw something in there about White Lumber Company. And I did. I found there were 2 maps in there. Can't see them from there, but anyway, these 2 maps show section after section of land owned by White Lumber Company, primarily in Franklin and Richland Parish. So I know they had land there as well as closer home. Henderson was also known as a dairy farmer and owned pasture probably to the east and north of the house. A.H. Henderson was a major stockholder and president of the company. Other Ruston investors had smaller shares, including E.L. Tewton, who was vice president of the company. I do remember hearing stories from my grandfather traveling by train to St. Louis and Chicago on marketing and sales trips. The company and Mr. Henderson owned a couple of thousand acres in Lincoln Parish, verified by courthouse records here, and much more to the south of us. Marcia Richardson donated the china cabinet, and in that was those maps showing 1930 and 1931 land holdings. Ironically, in doing the title search of the property that I live on north of Ruston, ownership records indicated that it was part of a tract once owned by White Lumber Company. According to Marcia, at the time, Mr. Henderson was one of the wealthiest men in Ruston with many business interests. However, the Great Depression of the 1930s broke him. He and White Lumber Company lost over 70,000 acres of land in order to pay debts, and also the inability to pay the taxes on the property and defaulted. In 1934, the company went into receivership. A new charter was granted in 1938 as White Lumber Manufacturing, but was never a major player in the timber industry. In 1956, the company was completely dissolved. I'm going to end here. Saying this particular part of town was almost, and these are my words, almost like a lumberman's row, if you will. This home was a part from the Davis family. Alex Hunt, right next door. One of the named Davis daughters I mentioned, Virginia Lasky, lived across here, across the street. Then Mr. Henderson, my grandparents' house, certainly not of the stature of those homes, but was in the parking lot where the library is now. And I don't know, there were so many others that many of you probably know more about than I, but was certainly, I think, an interesting part of town with all of the timber and lumber industry. Again, I've only scratched the surface of the importance of the timber industry in our part of the state, but I hope the fragrance of our history will spur your curiosity to seek more information about our past. The museum's purpose is to preserve some of our past culture, and I encourage you to visit and support its mission. I also invite you to hear other presentations over the next 2 weeks as part of the Fall Chautauqua series. Just a couple of other show and tell things. Today, there are huge machines that grab a pine tree and slice it and dump it over. And the late 1800s, early 1900s, this is what you cut a big pine tree with. 2 men on a crosscut saw. This one, I don't know the exact history, belonged to a great uncle, probably dates to around 1900. It was called a 2-man crosscut saw. A 1-man saw could also look like this. This one probably is not quite as old, maybe 75, 80 years old or so, but was probably used more for trimming or for cutting the ends off. And the men, in addition to the crosscut saws, would go into the woods with a double-bitted axe over their shoulder, probably much larger than this one. This one is, I don't know, 50 or 60 years old, but they would look similar to this, but probably a little bit larger. Can you imagine trying to cut a 3.5-foot diameter pine tree with this equipment? Pretty amazing. I will also spread out on the back table there. This is a collage of pictures of the Davis family that is loaned to me by Elizabeth and James for this. And if you want to look at it a little bit closer, I'll see if I can anchor it down on the back table there once we finish. And that concludes what I have to say. I'll be glad to try to answer questions, although, as I said in the beginning, my knowledge is very limited, and I've had fun exploring this, and would encourage you to, on your own, maybe look into this or other parts of our local history.
Now,
Yes.
with Gandy, would that have been involved in Gansville, maybe?
I'm sorry.
Gandy, that you mentioned, Gandy, Louisiana?
Gandy, Gandy.
Would that have eventually evolved or somehow gone misinterpreted into Gansville?
No, no, the Dansville Mill, I've, I've, I've seen it on the map. Matter of fact, it's on a map, it's on a map in this book, but Danville is a separate mill.
There was a mill there.
Yes, yes.
Gansville.
In Danville and at Gandy.
Gansville.
Gansville, he is saying Gans with a G.
Dansville, Gans,
G-A-N.
oh, no, oh, I'm not familiar with Gansville, no. I thought you said Dansville, but, I'm not familiar with that name.
Because that's real close to Gandy.
Pardon?
I think that's close to where Gandy was.
Okay.
Some of Jimmy's
Could have
family.
been. You know, actually, these towns didn't move very far. They may have moved only 10 or 15 miles into another tract of timber because, again, you didn't haul these logs by mule over dirt roads very far. So they would maybe lay 5 more miles of track, go build a new town.
Well, there was one town, I think it was where Mr. Seagull was from, McNairy. And that whole town picked up and moved to Arizona. And my mother
That was quite a move.
She was from Jerome, and it was a timber company.
Yeah.
And they moved from Louisiana the whole entire thing.
What was the name of the man in Spearsville? What was Henderson, or what was his first name?
Abraham H. Henderson.
Abraham H. Henderson.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you come across any data about the last existing stands of virgin woods, whether they're pine or hardwood? I was wondering if there were any virgin trees left.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm trying to remember which one of these two books, and it is mentioned. I hate to say, but yes, they mentioned the last virgin pine tree being cut, and it was that 3.5 foot diameter. It was one that was in that Ansley Hodge area. It was in that area, and I'm not sure exactly what year, but yes.
One of the big pictures they had at the Ansley Mill was the cutting of the last virgin pine. It was a huge tree.
Yeah, yeah. I do remember reading it was 3.5 feet in diameter, and the last virgin pine that this particular company cut. There may have been other trees in other locations, but in this immediate area south of Ruston, that was listed as the last one. You know, and looking at connections, I was talking to my sister-in-law, Barbara Kirkland, and she's from Mangum, and I was telling her about what I was doing. She said, Mangum was a sawmill town. I said, you gotta be kidding. I said, no, my great-grandparents came to Mangum and opened a sawmill, and when all the trees were cut, that's when they started cotton farming. So it was all across the state. These were vast hardwood forests over that far. But I never had any idea of the magnitude of the timber industry in that 50-year period between 1880 and 1930.
If the diameter was 3.5 feet, what in the world would the circumference have been? I know Coach Ronald would be disappointed.
Yeah, multiply that by 3.14.
5 times the radius square, but I don't know what.
Yeah. Somewhere around 12 feet or so, and 11, 12 feet at least in diameter.
Well, imagine how tall it was.
And which direction it would fall when you cut it. That's what you do with the saw like
I've
that.
seen pictures that historians have posted on Facebook, photographs of I mean, the people look like the size today, we would think of a dog, a little puppy or something, with these massive trees. I've seen that.
Billy Green tells on his walls that talk that they rode the train
Marvin, you were telling me about a train ride. From Ruston down to Ansley, huh?
So you go down and spend the day and go to the commissary, I guess?
One of the real fallout from the timber industry, that cutover stump land wasn't worth anything. Land wasn't worth anything at all in that day and age. But there were a few people who understood that, and they got into serious reforestation and buying up that worthless land for 2 bits an acre or less, under which they found an awful lot of oil. So several of the new fortunes came out of buying over the worthless leftover coal oil. Well, my uncle said the reason land was 2 bits an acre was nobody had more than time.
This is at Davis Brothers Collage, and I'll try to put it on the table.
That table in the back may have a better light.
Okay,
than that.
okay,
Yeah, this
okay,
one.
I'll do that. Okay. Well, thank you for coming out tonight, and again, we've got other programs coming up. I know yours is,
Like the rise and fall.
is it next week or 2 weeks?
It's next week.
Next week, and have
Rise and fall of Plankville, and see that ties in.
you ever heard of Plankville? It was right here close by,
Right by the country club, out by the Ruston.
It was within the city limits.
yeah, okay,
And then Wesley's gonna do Highway 80 the last week.
okay,
That'll be interesting.
okay.
I remember convoys on Highway 80.
There's sandwiches and water and coffee in the kitchen. I'd love for you to eat it all. Lots of cookies. Amelia, they're delicious cookies, and Kay and brought some too. We hadn't even opened them, but we can. So please go get you some. And thank you for coming, and hope you'll be back next week. And we'll put these pictures in the back.
Good job, bud.
Louisiana around 1900. And I remember, but I don't know, anything about it.
A lot of people around here, of course,
Yeah.
and Doc Ritchie.
Yeah.
That first book you were showing,
The James?
yeah, this was
Great job. Great
Yeah,
job.
that was a good book.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I read.
You can see where I pulled notes
Yeah, you got some.
out of.
Yeah.
Was this Trott's?
What?
Was this the book that Trott commissioned?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Or at least that's the foreword in there. I got that impression that.
Yeah, try
that,
Did you come across anything about the old Nick's Mill and the country club, and there was Zachary Mill on Highway 80, when the Barney Spring Road comes in?
No, I did see the name Nick's in there as one of the investors or something, but no other details.
That was a fairly good sized mill up there, that's a long time. Zachary wasn't that big, but it was there for a good while. There's a lot of small things around like that, I'm sure they were small flavors. Reed Mill, Mike Reed.
The Lawrence family had a mill up in Hyco, but it was primarily local
A lot of
needs.
these things.
Yeah, they may have used the Model T car to run the mill or something.
That's how Teal is buying all that orphan land.
Yeah.
You get tons of acres. Don't you know those polo shirts don't have pockets? I know what I mean.